The cave entrance had been hidden behind the rock slide for what must have been decades, and David Park only found it because his dog refused to stop digging at a gap between two massive limestone boulders that should have held no particular interest for a well-trained working animal. He'd been exploring the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky for 3 days now, working on a mapping project for the U.S. Geological survey that paid decently and kept him outdoors, where his post-service anxiety felt manageable rather than overwhelming. The contract was straightforward enough. Document cave entrances throughout a 50-square-mile section of the forest, assess their accessibility for potential public access or scientific study, and flag any geological features that might warrant closer examination by specialized teams. The work suited David's temperament and skills, requiring attention to detail, comfort with solitude, and the kind of physical endurance he'd developed during his army service. The forest itself contained hundreds of documented caves and probably thousands more that had never been officially recorded, all part of the vast karst system that ran beneath Kentucky like a hidden circulatory network carrying water and geological secrets through limestone passages carved over millions of years. Most cavers knew Kentucky as one of the premier destinations for spelunking in North America, home to Mammoth Cave and countless smaller systems that offered everything from easy walking passages to technical challenges that tested even experienced explorers. David's job was to find and document the entrances to these systems, not to explore their depths, though his background in mountain warfare had given him skills that occasionally led him to push further into promising caves than his contract strictly required. Beside him at the rock slide, digging with the focused intensity that marked all her working hours, Bear moved rocks and dirt with her powerful paws, despite David's repeated commands to stop and heal. The Anatolian shepherd was 4 years old, 90 pounds of muscle and protective instinct that had served alongside David for 2 years in Army Mountain Warfare School, before they'd both left active duty following an incident that had left them both physically intact but psychologically marked in ways that made civilian life necessary even when it wasn't entirely comfortable. She'd been trained for high-altitude patrol in Afghanistan, had excellent instincts about terrain and danger, and had saved David's life at least twice during operations by detecting threats before his human senses registered them. Her current fixation on this particular rock slide was unusual enough that David had stopped trying to redirect her attention and had instead begun to pay closer attention to what might be triggering her behavior. Bear, hold. David grabbed her collar gently, his touch firm but not harsh, and examined the gap she'd been widening between the boulders. Air was flowing from the opening, cool and damp with the distinctive mineral smell that marked cave systems, a scent David had learned to recognize during his weeks in the forest. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it through the gap, trying to see what had caught Bear's attention beyond simple cave entrance. The beam revealed darkness beyond the rocks, a void that suggested the gap opened into substantial space rather than just a crevice or dead end. The professional part of David's mind noted this was exactly the kind of discovery his contract called for, a previously undocumented cave entrance that would need to be assessed and catalogued. But another part of him, the part that had learned to trust Bear's instincts during their military service, wondered what specifically had triggered her interest. She'd walked past dozens of cave entrances during their survey work without showing particular excitement, treating them as routine geological features worth noting but not investigating. Her fixation on this one suggested something different about it, something her senses detected but that David's conscious awareness hadn't yet registered. He pulled out his GPS unit and marked the location with precision, noting the coordinates and adding a description of the rock slide and the airflow that indicated cave presence. Then he spent the next 90 minutes carefully widening the gap using a folding shovel from his pack, moving stones and clearing debris, while Bear watched with obvious impatience. her body language suggesting she wanted him to work faster, but her training keeping her from interfering with his deliberate progress. The rock slide had been caused by earthquake or erosion, David assessed, probably decades ago based on how vegetation had grown over and around the fallen stones. The slide had buried what had probably been a natural entrance, perhaps one that local cavers had known about before the rocks fell, or perhaps one that had never been discovered by humans at all. Kentucky's cave systems were so extensive that even lifelong residents occasionally stumbled onto entrances that had somehow escaped previous documentation, hidden in dense forest, or covered by seasonal vegetation, or simply overlooked because they didn't look like obvious openings from casual observation. Moving enough rock to create human-sized access took patience and physical effort that left David sweating despite the cool forest air. He worked methodically, testing each stone's stability before applying force, making sure he wasn't destabilizing the rock slide in ways that could cause further collapse. By early afternoon, he'd created an opening large enough to squeeze through, roughly circular and about 3 feet in diameter, with clear airflow that suggested whatever space lay beyond was connected to larger cave system rather than being isolated pocket. He examined the entrance carefully before committing to entry, checking for structural stability around the opening and making sure he had clear path back out if conditions inside proved dangerous or if the rock slide showed signs of further movement. Cave exploration was inherently risky even with proper equipment and experienced partners, and solo caving violated most safety protocols that responsible spelunkers followed. But David's job didn't come with a partner. His budget didn't allow hiring guides for every site he investigated, and his military background had taught him to assess risks carefully while accepting that some situations required calculated risk-taking rather than perfect safety. He'd learned to be cautious during his army service, to evaluate dangers systematically, and to trust his judgment about when to push forward and when to retreat. He'd also learned that sometimes the most valuable discoveries came from being willing to accept risks that more cautious people avoided, though he tried to balance that knowledge against the reality that he was working alone in remote forest where a serious accident could easily become fatal before help arrived. Bear whined and pressed against the opening, clearly wanting to go inside despite her earlier wariness. David pulled out his climbing harness and attached a 30-foot leash to Bear's working collar, not wanting her to range too far ahead in an unknown cave system where dangers might include sudden drops, unstable formations, or other hazards his light couldn't immediately reveal. Then he activated his headlamp, secured his pack with rope and emergency supplies, and squeezed through the entrance into the darkness beyond, Bear following so close behind him that he could feel her breath on his legs as they moved through the opening. The passage was tight initially, requiring crawling through a constriction, perhaps 30 feet long and barely wide enough for David's shoulders, with Bear squirming behind him and occasionally bumping against his boots in her eagerness to continue forward. The passage walls showed scratch marks that might have been from animal claws or might have been from previous human explorers, though David saw no other evidence of recent human presence like disturbed formations or trash that careless cavers sometimes left behind. The constriction opened suddenly into a larger chamber, and David emerged into a space roughly the size of a small house, with ceiling high enough that his headlamp beam couldn't immediately locate it in the darkness above. Glowstone covered one wall in frozen cascades of mineral deposits that had been growing for thousands or possibly millions of years, their rippled surfaces catching his light in ways that created shadows and highlights that made the formations look almost alive. Stalactites hung from what he could see of the ceiling, their formations suggesting this cave had been sealed and developing undisturbed for a very long time, possibly since the rockslide had closed off the entrance, or possibly longer if this chamber had never been accessible to humans through any other passage. The air was cool and damp, probably around 55 degrees, with humidity high enough that David could see his breath when he exhaled toward his headlamp beam. The chamber floor was littered with breakdown, chunks of ceiling that had fallen at various times, and with formations that had grown up from the floor to meet the stalactites descending from above. Some of these column formations were massive, several feet in diameter, suggesting ages measured in geological time rather than human timescales. Bear pulled forward on her leash, her attention fixed on something across the chamber that David couldn't yet see, and he followed her lead across uneven floor that required careful foot placement to avoid stumbling on rocks or damaging formations. His headlamp swept across the space methodically, documenting features for the report he'd file with USGS. Noting the chamber's approximate dimensions, the formation types, and the passages that led away from this main room into what was probably an extensive cave system. That's when the beam caught something that didn't belong in any cave system David had ever studied or read about in his preparation for this survey work. Bones. Massive bones, far too large to be from any animal David could identify, even with his limited knowledge of paleontology and natural history. They were arranged in rough anatomical order, suggesting they'd belonged to a single creature that had died here, with skull positioned at one end of the scatter pattern, and what looked like leg bones and vertebrae extending away from the skull, in a configuration that suggested the skeleton had been relatively intact when the creature died and had only been disturbed by time and possibly by water flow during seasonal flooding. The skeleton was incomplete, with ribs broken and scattered across a wide area, some portions missing entirely or buried under breakdown, but enough remained to indicate size that made David's mind struggle with scale and proportion. The skull alone was 5 feet long, massive and broad, with eye sockets large enough to fit basketballs and teeth that looked designed for tearing rather than grinding, predator dentition that suggested this creature had been apex species in whatever ecosystem it inhabited. From skull to where the pelvis should be, measuring visually against his own 6-foot height as reference, the skeleton measured at least 30 feet, and possibly more if the missing tail sections were included. David stood frozen, his headlamp beam playing across bones that shouldn't exist according to any biological knowledge he possessed, trying to process what he was seeing through frameworks of known biology and paleontology that simply didn't have categories for creatures of this size living in cave environments. His first thought was dinosaur, but the bone structure was wrong for any species he'd seen in museums or documentaries. The limbs were too long proportionally, the skull showing features that didn't match any evolutionary path he'd studied during his geology courses. The vertebrae were enormous, but showed adaptations for flexibility rather than the rigid structure he'd expect from large prehistoric reptiles. This was something else entirely, something that his rational mind couldn't immediately categorize using existing knowledge. Bear approached the skeleton cautiously, her earlier eagerness replaced by wariness that made her hackles rise, and her body language suggest she was detecting something that made her nervous. She sniffed at the bones with obvious unease, but didn't show the fear David expected, given the size of the creature these remains represented. Instead, she showed confusion, the same kind of behavioral uncertainty she'd displayed during their service when encountering situations her training hadn't prepared her for, like the time they'd found unexploded ordnance that was emitting frequencies outside her normal detection range. David moved closer, examining the bones with his headlamp from multiple angles, trying to understand what he was looking at and what it might mean. The bones weren't fossilized, he realized with growing unease. They were still white or pale grey, still showing the subtle ivory sheen of relatively fresh bone rather than the mineralized brown or grey of fossils that had been buried for millions of years and had undergone the slow chemical transformation that turned organic material into stone. There was tissue attached in places, dried and mummified by the cave's constant temperature and low humidity, but definitely organic material rather than mineralized remains. Tendons still connected some joint surfaces, leathery and dark, but recognizable as once living tissue. And the smell, now that David was close enough to notice it, despite the cave's generally clean air, was wrong for ancient remains. Not the musty scent he'd expect from bones that were thousands or millions of years old, but something more pungent, more organic, suggesting decay processes that hadn't completed their natural progression. David pulled out his phone, knowing he wouldn't have service this deep in the cave, but needing to document what he'd found for the report he'd be filing and for his own reference when trying to explain this discovery to people who'd probably think he was mistaken or exaggerating. He took dozens of photographs from every angle he could access without disturbing the skeleton, capturing its position relative to the chamber features, photographing individual bones in detail, creating a visual record that would be essential for whatever investigation followed his discovery. Then he carefully collected a small bone fragment from the scattered remains, a piece perhaps 3 inches long that had broken off from a larger element and was lying separate from the main skeleton. He sealed it in a plastic evidence bag from his first aid kit, marking it with date, time, and location using a permanent marker. The fragment would be essential for analysis, would allow experts to determine what this creature had been through DNA testing or chemical analysis or whatever methods scientists used to identify unknown biological materials. He backed away from the skeleton slowly, his mind racing through implications and possibilities, trying to understand what he'd discovered and what he should do about it. If these bones were recent enough to still show organic tissue, if this creature had died within the time frame suggested by their condition rather than in prehistoric past, then something impossibly large had been living in or near this cave system recently enough to leave remains that hadn't fully decomposed. That possibility violated everything David understood about biology and about the cave systems beneath Kentucky. Animals this size couldn't exist without leaving evidence of their presence, couldn't move through environments without being observed by humans, couldn't maintain viable populations without resources that would be obvious to anyone studying these ecosystems. But the evidence was right in front of him, undeniable and massive, and completely inconsistent with what should be possible. The rational part of David's mind, the part trained in geological survey and scientific method during his college years and in systematic threat assessment during his military service, insisted there had to be an explanation that didn't require rewriting biology textbooks or accepting that unknown megafauna had been living beneath Kentucky without anyone noticing. Hoax was obvious possibility that he needed to consider seriously. Someone could have planted fake bones here to generate publicity or confusion or for reasons David couldn't immediately guess. But the size and positioning of the skeleton made elaborate hoax seem unlikely. Moving bones this massive into a cave this remote, through passages that required crawling and climbing, would require equipment and effort that seemed disproportionate to any reasonable hoax payoff. And the condition of the bones, with tissue still attached and the smell of relatively recent decay, all suggested authenticity that simple fakery using artificial materials couldn't easily match. Another possibility was that these were actual fossilized remains that David was misreading, that the white color and tissue-like attachments were mineral deposits or chemical reactions rather than organic material. But David had seen enough fossils during his geology coursework to recognize mineralization when it was present, and these bones showed none of the characteristic changes that marked fossil formation. They looked and smelled like relatively recent remains, however impossible that seemed. Bear barked sharply, pulling David from his analytical spiral. She was staring at a passage on the far side of the chamber, a tunnel, perhaps 6 feet high, that led deeper into the cave system, away from the entrance they'd used, and into darkness that David's headlamp couldn't penetrate from his current position. Her body language suggested alert. rather than alarm, focused attention rather than fear, but David's instincts warned against exploring further without backup and better equipment. He'd found something significant here, possibly dangerous, and the responsible action was to retreat and report rather than pushing ahead alone into unknown passages where who knew what might be waiting. "Come on, girl, we're leaving." He tugged gently on Bear's leash, and she followed reluctantly, looking back at the passage as though something there compelled her attention, as though she'd detected a scent or sound that her instincts told her was important, but that she couldn't communicate to David through their limited shared language. They made their way back through the chamber, moving carefully around the skeleton and through the formations, then through the tight entrance passage that seemed even more constricting now that David's mind was full of images of 30-foot creatures that had somehow lived in these cave systems. He emerged into afternoon sunlight that felt almost aggressive after the cave's darkness, too bright and too warm after the constant cool of the underground environment. David sat outside the entrance for 10 minutes, breathing fresh air and trying to calm his heart rate back to baseline, while Bear lay beside him, panting from exertion and possibly from the stress of encountering something that had disturbed her more than she'd shown while they were inside. He pulled out his water bottle and drank deeply, then poured water into his cupped hand for Bear to lap up, both of them needing hydration and a moment to process what they'd just experienced. He'd found things in caves before during his survey work, had documented interesting formations and discovered artifacts from previous human use of cave systems. He'd once found Native American pottery in a cave in Tennessee, carefully positioned pieces that were probably several hundred years old and that had generated significant archaeological interest when he'd reported them. He'd found the skeletons of animals that had fallen into caves and been unable to escape, sad reminders that these systems could be deadly traps for creatures that entered without understanding the terrain. But he'd never found anything like what lay in the chamber behind him, never encountered remains that challenged his understanding of what was possible in the natural world, and that demanded explanations he wasn't qualified to provide. He needed to report this immediately, needed to bring in experts who could assess what he'd found and determine appropriate response. But he also needed to think carefully about how he reported it, about what details to emphasize and what claims to avoid, until experts had verified his observations. Saying he'd found a 30-foot skeleton would sound like exaggeration or confusion. Saying he'd found bones that appeared recent despite their size would sound like he didn't understand fossilization processes. He needed to frame his report carefully, sticking to observable facts and letting experts draw conclusions about what those facts meant. He hiked back to where he'd left his truck, a 3-mile trek through forest that felt longer than usual, given the weight of what he'd discovered and the mental energy he was spending on trying to understand it. Bear stayed close, her attention divided between the trail ahead and the direction of the cave, as though she wanted to return despite David's decision to leave, as though whatever she detected there was calling to her in ways that transcended her training and her usual responses to environmental features. When they reached the truck, David immediately checked his phone and found 2 bars of signal, enough to make calls and send emails. He pulled out his laptop and connected it through his phone's hotspot, then began composing a careful report to his supervisor at USGS, while his memory of the discovery was still fresh and detailed. His supervisor was Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist in her 40s who'd hired him for this mapping project after reviewing his credentials and conducting an interview that had focused as much on his ability to work independently in remote locations as on his technical knowledge of cave systems. She'd been fair and professional in all their interactions, had responded promptly to his questions and reports, and had seemed genuinely interested in the survey work he was conducting, even when his findings were routine documentation of known features rather than exciting discoveries. He wrote the report carefully, describing the rock slide and the hidden entrance, explaining how Bear's behavior had led him to investigate more thoroughly than he might have otherwise. He described the chamber and its features in objective terms, then moved to the bones, emphasizing their size and arrangement while being careful about making claims regarding their age or origin. He noted the apparent presence of organic tissue and the unusual coloration that suggested they weren't typical fossils, but he stopped short of speculating about what species they might represent or when they might have died. He attached his photographs and noted that he'd collected a sample for analysis, all while maintaining the professional tone that his contract and scientific protocol required. He sent the report to Dr. Chen and copied the regional USGS office, then sat in his truck with Bear and waited for response. The afternoon stretched toward evening, the forest around him settling into the quieter rhythms that marked the transition from day to night. His phone rang first, the call coming from Dr. Chen's direct line rather than the main office number. "David, I've reviewed your report and the photographs. I need to make sure I'm understanding correctly what you're describing. You found a skeleton that measures approximately 30 feet in length, with bones that appear to retain organic tissue rather than showing typical fossilization." "That's correct. I measured visually using my own height as reference, and I examined the bones closely enough to confirm they show characteristics of relatively recent remains rather than mineralized fossils." "And you collected a sample?" "Yes, a small fragment that was already separated from the main skeleton. It's sealed in an evidence bag with documentation of collection location and time." Silence on the line. Just the sound of Dr. Chen breathing and possibly typing. Then her voice came back, more careful now, with the kind of controlled tone that David recognized from his military service as someone trying to maintain professional composure while processing information that didn't fit their expectations. "David, I need you to send me your precise GPS coordinates and to remain at your current location. I'm going to make some calls, and someone will probably be contacting you within the next few hours. Don't return to the cave, don't discuss this with anyone else, and if anyone asks what you're working on, just tell them it's routine survey work." "Is there a problem with my report?" "No, your report is excellent, detailed and professional. But what you've described requires immediate expert assessment from people with more specialized knowledge than I have. This is beyond typical geological survey, David. If your observations are accurate, and I have no reason to think they're not given your background and the quality of your documentation, then you've found something that needs immediate attention from multiple agencies." The call ended with promises that someone would be in touch soon, and David sat in his truck trying to understand what Dr. Chen's carefully controlled response actually meant. He'd expected interest in his discovery, had anticipated that paleontologists would want to examine the site and that his find might generate some professional excitement. But the urgency in Dr. Chen's voice suggested she was treating this as more than just an interesting paleontological discovery, as though the bones represented something that required immediate containment or security rather than just scientific documentation. The next call came 90 minutes later, from a number David didn't recognize with an area code that suggested it was from somewhere in the Washington, D.C. metro area. He answered cautiously, and a male voice identified the caller as Dr. James Morrison from the Centers for Disease Control, which confused David entirely until Dr. Morrison began explaining why CDC was interested in his discovery. "Mr. Park, I've been briefed on your findings by Dr. Chen at USGS. I need to ask you some detailed questions about your health and your exposure to the remains you discovered. This is precautionary, not because we have specific reason to believe you're in danger, but because skeletal remains of unusual size showing recent decay could potentially harbor pathogens or other biological hazards." David answered questions about his health status, about any symptoms he might be experiencing, about how long he'd been in the cave, and whether he'd had direct contact with the bones or the tissues attached to them. Dr. Morrison was thorough but not alarmist, and by the end of the interview, David understood that CDC was treating his discovery as potential biological hazard until they could confirm otherwise through testing and analysis. Mr. Park, I'm going to need you to remain at your current location and to monitor yourself for any unusual symptoms. A response team is being assembled and should reach your location within 2 to 3 hours. They'll need you to guide them to the cave entrance and to provide detailed information about the chamber conditions and what you observed. Do not return to the cave before they arrive. Do not allow anyone else to enter if you encounter other people in the area. And if you start experiencing any unusual symptoms, fever, respiratory difficulty, skin irritation, neurological changes, call this number immediately. Dr. Morrison provided a direct line and ended the call, leaving David with more questions than answers and with growing concern about what he'd actually discovered in that cave. Why would CDC be involved in what seemed like a paleontological finding? Why the emphasis on his health and the speed with which they were assembling a response team? The concern about pathogens made some sense if the remains were recent enough to harbor active disease organisms, but the level of urgency seemed disproportionate unless there was something about this situation that Dr. Morrison hadn't explicitly stated. The response team arrived just after dark, which was sooner than the 2 to 3 hours Dr. Morrison had estimated. 3 vehicles pulled into the small clearing where David had parked, SUVs with government plates and equipment racks on their roofs. 7 people emerged, 5 men and 2 women, all wearing casual outdoor clothing that didn't look like official uniforms, but that showed the kind of coordination that suggested they'd worked together before. They carried equipment that looked more appropriate for hazmat response than archaeological excavation: portable air quality monitors, sealed collection containers, protective gear that could be deployed if needed. The lead investigator introduced herself as Dr. Rebecca Walsh, epidemiologist with CDC, and she immediately began asking David detailed questions about his cave entry and exposure, questions that went beyond what Dr. Morrison had asked on the phone. She wanted to know exactly what route he'd taken through the entrance passage, how long he'd spent in the chamber with the skeleton, whether he'd touched any surfaces beyond the bone fragment he'd collected, whether Bear had made contact with the remains or with any fluids that might have been present. She examined Bear visually, checking for any signs of distress or unusual behavior, and had one of her team members collect a fur sample using a sterile swab. After 30 minutes of questioning that felt more like medical screening than scientific interview, Dr. Walsh finally began explaining what the response team was actually investigating, and her explanation made David understand why the urgency and the involvement of CDC made sense given what he'd reported. Mr. Park, your discovery is being treated as potential biological hazard until we can confirm otherwise through testing. Skeletal remains that appear recent but are abnormally large could indicate several concerning scenarios: genetic modification programs that went wrong, exposure to growth-accelerating pathogens, contamination with industrial chemicals that affect biological development, or possibly evidence of species we weren't aware existed. We need to secure the site, collect comprehensive samples, and determine whether there's any risk to you, your dog, the local ecosystem, or the broader public health. You think someone created this creature, like illegal genetic experiments? That's one possibility we need to evaluate. The alternatives, naturally occurring giant species that somehow avoided detection, elaborate hoax using real bones from unknown source, or remains that we're misinterpreting due to unusual preservation conditions, all require thorough investigation. Until we understand what we're dealing with, we need to treat this seriously and maintain protocols that protect everyone involved. The answer was careful and professional, covering multiple possibilities without committing to any single explanation. David appreciated the honesty, even while finding the range of scenarios she'd outlined somewhat overwhelming. The idea that someone might be conducting illegal genetic experiments in Kentucky caves felt like something from science fiction. The alternative, that an unknown giant species had been living beneath the forest without being detected, felt equally implausible. An elaborate hoax still seemed unlikely given the practical difficulties of staging something this extensive in such a remote location. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we secure the site and conduct our initial assessment. You'll need to guide us to the cave entrance since you're the only one who knows where it is. We'll enter as a team, document everything thoroughly, collect samples for analysis, and assess whether the site needs to be sealed pending further investigation. Your role will be to guide us there and to provide information about what you observed, but you won't be entering the cave with us. The team has specialized equipment and training for this kind of response." David led them back to the cave entrance. The 3-mile hike taking longer in darkness, even with everyone carrying high-powered lights and wearing headlamps. The trail was less defined in places than it had been during daylight, and David had to navigate by GPS and memory rather than by visual landmarks. Bear stayed close to him, her attention divided between the team members following behind and the direction of the cave, and as they got closer to the site, her behavior changed, becoming more alert and focused in ways that suggested she remembered what they'd found there and was processing that memory through whatever cognitive frameworks dogs used to categorize their experiences. When they reached the entrance David had uncovered, Dr. Walsh had 2 team members establish a perimeter with markers and caution tape, creating a defined boundary around the site that would prevent accidental intrusion by any hikers or cavers who might happen across the location. The rest of the team prepared to enter, spending 20 minutes checking their equipment and reviewing safety protocols that appeared to have been established for exactly this kind of situation, suggesting this wasn't the first time CDC had responded to reports of unusual biological findings in remote locations. David was required to stay outside the perimeter with Bear, his role complete now that he'd guided them to the site. He sat on a fallen log near the entrance and watched as lights disappeared into the cave, wondering what the team would find and whether his interpretation of the bones would match what experts with more training and better equipment would determine. Part of him hoped they'd find some mundane explanation, some reason why the bones looked unusual, but were actually just ordinary fossils that he'd misidentified. But another part of him knew that his observations had been careful and that the bones had shown characteristics that wouldn't be easily explained away by conventional paleontology. 2 hours later, Dr. Walsh emerged from the cave entrance, looking shaken in a way that made David's anxiety spike, despite his attempt to stay calm and professional. She pulled off her respirator and sat heavily on a boulder near where David waited with Bear, taking several deep breaths of the cool night air before speaking, her composure clearly strained by whatever she'd seen inside. "Mr. Park, what you found in that cave is going to require extensive investigation and probably multi-agency coordination. The skeleton is real. It's recent based on tissue condition and decomposition stage, and it doesn't match any known species in any database our team has immediate access to. We're going to need to secure this site, establish a research facility, and probably bring in additional expertise from paleontology, biology, genetics, and possibly other fields I haven't thought of yet." "What do you think it is?" David asked, needing some kind of framework for understanding what he'd discovered, even if that framework was preliminary or uncertain. "Honestly, I have no idea. But I can tell you what our preliminary field analysis suggests, and you need to understand that this information is preliminary and could change as we conduct more thorough testing. The bones show evidence of very recent death, probably within the last 48 to 72 hours, based on tissue condition, decomposition stage, and certain chemical markers we can detect with field equipment. That timeline is completely inconsistent with the skeleton being where it is, deep in a sealed cave system, which suggests either the creature died elsewhere and was moved here through means we can't currently explain, or it was living in this cave system and died naturally within the past few days. David felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically, felt the implications of what Dr. Walsh was telling him cascade through his mind in ways that changed every assumption he'd made about his discovery. You're saying this thing died 2 days ago, not decades or centuries or millions of years ago, but within the same week I found it. That's what the preliminary evidence suggests, yes. The tissue samples we've collected show cellular structure that's consistent with recent death. The chemical composition of the bone and tissue indicates decomposition processes that are still active. We even found evidence of what might be recent metabolic activity, though we need laboratory analysis to confirm that finding, which raises obvious questions about what this creature was, where it came from, how it survived in cave conditions, and whether there are more of them somewhere in these cave systems or elsewhere. And the size, that's real, not some trick of perception or preservation. The size is real. We've conducted careful measurements using calibrated tools, and the skeleton measures just over 32 feet from skull to the distal end of what appears to be a tail structure. The skull alone is 5 feet 2 inches in length. The leg bones suggest it could have stood approximately 12 to 15 feet tall when alive. This is a massive creature by any standard, larger than any known mammal and approaching the size of some prehistoric species, but with morphology that doesn't match any known taxonomic group. She paused, seeming to consider how much to tell him, then continued with obvious reluctance to make claims she couldn't fully support yet. Mr. Park, we're treating this as potential crisis situation until we can confirm it's not. Unknown species of this size appearing in documented cave systems within days of dying suggests something has changed recently in ecosystems we thought we understood. We need to find out what that change is, whether it poses risks beyond this immediate discovery, and how we should respond to protect both scientific knowledge and public safety. And if you're following along with this story and wondering what kind of creature could be 30 feet long and die in a Kentucky cave this week without anyone noticing until David and Bear stumbled onto its remains, you definitely need to subscribe to see where this investigation leads, because what the scientists are about to discover is going to challenge everything we think we know about what's living in the cave systems beneath our feet. And the implications go far beyond just one skeleton. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when they realize this skeleton isn't the only one. Give this a like if you're already hooked by the mystery and want to support content that takes scientific speculation seriously, and share it with someone who loves stories where initial discoveries spiral into revelations that nobody was prepared for. The site was secured overnight with perimeter established and guards posted to prevent unauthorized access by hikers, cavers, or anyone else who might wander into the area. David was required to stay at a temporary camp the team established near the cave entrance, available for additional questioning and under observation in case delayed health effects developed from his exposure to the skeleton and the cave environment. Bear stayed with him, both of them confined to a tent, while the investigation continued through the night, with team members rotating through shifts to maintain continuous monitoring and documentation. Around 3 a.m., David was awakened by commotion outside his tent, voices that were urgent but controlled, suggesting something had happened that required immediate attention but wasn't quite an emergency. He emerged to find the team gathered around portable monitors showing what appeared to be infrared imaging from deep inside the cave system, imagery that was being transmitted in real time from drones, or possibly from team members who'd pushed further into the passages than the initial entry had allowed. Dr. Walsh noticed him and gestured him over, her expression grim in the blue light from the monitors. "Mr. Park, your dog showed intense interest in a passage beyond the chamber where you found the first skeleton. Did you explore that passage at all during your initial entry? No. Bear seemed fixated on it, kept looking in that direction, but I decided to retreat and report rather than investigating further. I was alone, I didn't have backup, and pushing deeper seemed like poor risk management given what I'd already found. Good judgment. We sent a drone down that passage about 2 hours ago, equipped with infrared and standard cameras, along with sensors for atmospheric composition and temperature. The passage extends for approximately half a mile at a descending angle before opening into a much larger cavern system, significantly bigger than the chamber where you made your discovery. And Mr. Park, we found more remains. At least a dozen more skeletons, all similar size to the one you documented, all in various states of decay, ranging from completely skeletal to what appears to be very recent death, possibly within the last week. David stared at the infrared images displayed on the monitors, watching as the drone's camera panned across massive bones scattered throughout a cavern that looked like a mass death site, a place where multiple large creatures had died in close proximity. The thermal imaging showed temperature variations that suggested some areas of the cavern were warmer than others, possibly from geothermal activity or possibly from decomposition heat, if the most recent deaths were producing biological breakdown that generated thermal signatures. What killed them? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. Unknown, but we're seeing patterns that suggest they didn't all die at the same time. The skeletal remains you found initially appears to be several weeks old, based on decomposition stage. The remains we're seeing in the deeper cavern show a range of ages from months old to potentially just days old. This wasn't a sudden catastrophic event that killed an entire population simultaneously. This appears to be a die-off that's been happening over an extended period, possibly weeks or months, with individuals dying at different times, but all within a relatively compressed time frame from an evolutionary or geological perspective. Disease, David suggested, thinking about why CDC would be involved and what kinds of pathogens could cause mass mortality across a population. Possibly. That's one of our primary hypotheses. But we're also seeing evidence that could suggest starvation, environmental poisoning, oxygen depletion, or possibly predation by something we haven't identified yet. The deeper cavern shows areas where bones have been disturbed in ways that might indicate scavenging or deliberate arrangement, though it's too early to say whether that's from geological processes, from other creatures, or from some behavior of the dying individuals themselves. Doctor, Walsh pulled up additional images on the monitor showing close-ups of individual skeletons in the deeper cavern. Some showed obvious signs of trauma, bones broken or showing marks that might be bite patterns. Others appeared intact, but positioned in ways that suggested they died while trying to reach something, their bodies oriented toward specific features of the cavern as though they'd been moving toward goals when death overtook them. Mr. Park, I need you to understand the magnitude of what we're discussing here. If these creatures were living in this cave system until very recently, if they represent a breeding population of unknown species that somehow avoided human detection despite their size, and despite centuries of cave exploration in this region, then either our understanding of these cave systems and their ecosystems is fundamentally incomplete, or something very strange has been happening beneath Kentucky and possibly beneath other regions without anyone noticing or documenting it. David thought about the vast network of caves that ran beneath the state, thousands of miles of mapped passages, and tens of thousands more miles of passages that remained unexplored or undiscovered. Mammoth Cave alone contained over 400 miles of surveyed passages, and new sections were still being discovered by exploration teams that pushed into Virgin Passage. The Daniel Boone National Forest and surrounding regions contained hundreds of smaller cave systems, many of which connected to each other through passages that were too difficult to navigate or too dangerous to explore without specialized training and equipment. Could a population of giant creatures have survived in that network without being detected? The logistics seemed impossible when he thought about it systematically. Creatures this size would need substantial food sources, would produce waste that would be detectable, would make noise that cavers would hear, would leave traces of their presence that any competent spelunker would recognize. Yet the evidence was lying in the cave system beneath them, dozens of massive skeletons representing creatures that had apparently been alive recently enough that their deaths hadn't had time to progress through complete decomposition. Over the next days, the investigation expanded dramatically as more teams arrived and the scope of the discovery became clearer. More equipment was brought in, including ground-penetrating radar that could map the cave systems without requiring direct human exploration of every passage. Portable laboratories were established in reinforced tents that could handle the analysis of biological samples under conditions that prevented contamination or escape of potential pathogens. The clearing where David had initially parked his truck transformed into a substantial field station, with multiple tents housing equipment and personnel, with generators providing power for instruments that required more stable electricity than solar panels or batteries could reliably supply. David was interviewed repeatedly by different specialists, each one wanting his account of the discovery and his observations about Bear's behavior, about the cave conditions, about any sounds or smells or visual cues he'd noticed that might provide clues about what had been living in these systems and what had caused their apparent extinction. He showed them his photographs, provided the bone fragment he'd collected for priority analysis, and spent hours with various experts going over every detail of his cave entry and his observations in the chamber. He was also examined medically with thoroughness that went beyond the initial health screening. Blood samples were collected and tested for unusual pathogens, antibodies, chemical exposures, anything that might indicate he'd been infected or contaminated during his cave exploration. Bear was examined equally thoroughly by veterinary specialists who took samples and conducted behavioral assessments, looking for signs of illness or neurological changes that might indicate exposure to something harmful in the cave environment. Through all of it, David and Bear remained at the camp, essentially confined though not formally detained, both as witnesses to the discovery and as subjects of ongoing medical monitoring that would continue for weeks according to the protocols. Dr. Walsh explained. It wasn't comfortable, but David understood the necessity. If he'd been exposed to some novel pathogen that had killed the cave creatures, identifying that pathogen early would be essential for treatment and for preventing potential spread to others. The preliminary results started coming back after 72 hours, and Dr. Walsh briefed David on what they'd learned, calling him to her command tent, where she worked surrounded by monitors and equipment that made the space feel more like military operations center than scientific field station. She looked exhausted, clearly having slept very little since the investigation began, but her focus remained sharp as she pulled up data displays and images on her laptop. Mr. Park, I'm going to share information with you that's currently classified, pending further investigation and review by agencies I report to. You're being given access to this information based on your military security clearance, which was expedited and elevated given your role in this discovery and your need to understand what you've been exposed to. What I tell you cannot be shared with anyone outside this investigation, not with family, not with friends, not with any media if they somehow track you down. Do you understand and accept these terms? I understand and accept, David confirmed, recognizing the formula from his army service when classified briefings were being conducted. Dr. Walsh pulled up several data displays showing complex charts and graphs that David couldn't fully interpret, but that clearly meant something significant to her. The DNA analysis of the bone sample you collected has produced results that are unprecedented in my experience and in the experience of every specialist we've consulted. The creature shows genetic markers that are partially consistent with known mammalian lineages, suggesting distant evolutionary relationship to animals we're familiar with. But the genome also contains extensive sequences that don't match anything in any database we have access to, including comprehensive databases maintained by NIH, USDA, and various international research institutions. She pulled up what appeared to be a genetic comparison chart, showing the creature's DNA aligned against various known species. It's like someone took mammalian DNA as a starting point and modified it extensively, adding elements that serve functions we can't identify through standard genetic analysis. The modifications aren't random mutations accumulated through natural selection. They show patterns of organization and purposeful arrangement that look more like intentional engineering than like natural evolutionary processes. The sophistication of these modifications exceeds anything human genetic science is currently capable of producing, which suggests either covert research programs operating far beyond publicly acknowledged capabilities or... She trailed off, seeming reluctant to complete the thought. But David understood what she wasn't saying. Or something non-human created these creatures through technologies we don't possess. That's the implication, yes, though we're being very careful about making that claim officially until we've exhausted every alternative explanation. But Mr. Park, the genetic evidence is supported by other findings that make the engineering hypothesis increasingly difficult to dismiss. The skeletal structure shows adaptations that appear designed for cave living, features that provide advantages in underground environments, but that would be disadvantageous on the surface. The eyes, based on socket structure and what little soft tissue remains, were adapted for extremely low light conditions, possibly capable of seeing in near-complete darkness using mechanisms we don't fully understand yet. The respiratory system shows modifications that would allow efficient oxygen extraction in environments with depleted atmospheric oxygen, which is common in deep cave systems where ventilation is limited. You're saying these things were built specifically for living in caves? Someone or something engineered creatures designed to thrive in deep underground environments? That's what the evidence suggests. We're seeing similar patterns in the other specimens we've recovered from the deeper cavern, all showing genetic and physical adaptations that make sense for cave dwelling, but that wouldn't emerge through normal evolutionary pressures given Kentucky's geological history and the limited time these cave systems have been accessible to large fauna. Dr. Walsh pulled up more images, these showing detailed scans of skeletal structure that highlighted specific adaptations. Look at the bone density, for example. It's significantly lower than we'd expect for a creature this size living on the surface, where gravity imposes stronger structural requirements. But for a creature spending most of its time in underground environments where buoyancy and water-filled passages might be common, this reduced density would be an advantage, making swimming and navigation through flooded sections easier. The joint structures show extreme flexibility, far more than surface mammals, which would help with maneuvering through irregular passages and tight constrictions that these cave systems contain. David studied the images, trying to understand what he was looking at and what it meant. But if these creatures were engineered for cave living, who engineered them and why? What purpose would giant cave-dwelling creatures serve that would justify the sophisticated technology and resources required to create them? Excellent questions that we don't have answers to yet, but we're seeing evidence at other sites that might provide clues about the creators and their intentions. Other sites? David felt his focus sharpen. You mean this isn't an isolated discovery? There are more locations where similar remains have been found. Dr. Walsh nodded, her expression grim. The situation you've uncovered in Kentucky is not isolated or unique. We've been documenting similar findings across multiple sites in the United States and globally over the past 18 months. Findings that were being investigated quietly, without public disclosure, while we tried to understand what we were dealing with. Your discovery is the first one that involved a recently deceased specimen where we could study tissue that hadn't decomposed completely, which is why your find is particularly valuable scientifically and why the response has been so immediate and intense. She pulled up a map showing markers across the United States and several other countries, each marker representing a site where similar remains or evidence had been documented. David counted at least 30 markers just in North America, with additional markers scattered across Europe, Asia, South America, and Australia. Large skeletal remains, artificially constructed cave structures, technology bored tunnels extending miles into the earth, genetic evidence of engineering beyond current human capabilities. All of it appearing relatively suddenly over the past few years. All of it involving species or entities we can't identify through conventional biological or historical databases. The pattern is global, Mr. Park, and it's forcing us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about what's been living beneath Earth's surface and why we're only discovering it now. David stared at the map, trying to comprehend the scale of what Dr. Walsh was describing. What's your working theory? What do you think is actually happening? The working theory, and I want to emphasize this is preliminary and could change as we gather more evidence, is that we're seeing evidence of a subterranean civilization that existed beneath Earth's surface for an unknown period of time and has recently collapsed or gone extinct. The remains you're finding represent the last generation of that civilization, individuals who died during what appears to have been a catastrophic environmental failure or disease outbreak in the deep Earth systems they inhabited. The genetic engineering suggests they were either created by surface intelligence that we have no record of, or they were created by their own civilization as it developed underground, using technologies that parallel or exceed our own genetic capabilities. The explanation was so far outside David's normal frameworks for understanding the world that he had to consciously work to accept what he was hearing as serious hypothesis rather than science fiction speculation. But Dr. Walsh wasn't a fantasist or a conspiracy theorist. She was a trained epidemiologist with CDC, someone whose career and reputation depended on making evidence-based assessments and avoiding claims that couldn't be supported by rigorous analysis. If she was presenting this theory, it meant the evidence supporting it was substantial enough that dismissing it would require ignoring data that demanded explanation. If there was an entire civilization living miles beneath our feet, how did we never detect them? We have seismological networks that can detect earthquakes across the globe. We have mineral exploration that penetrates miles into the earth. We have deep mining operations and research drilling programs that should have encountered some evidence of organized presence if these beings were creating structures and living in large enough populations to constitute a civilization. Those are exactly the questions we're trying to answer. The preliminary assessment is that they lived primarily at depths below our normal exploration and exploitation activities, probably below 5 miles in most locations, possibly deeper in regions with extensive cave systems. The tunnels we're finding that lead to these depths are sophisticated enough to suggest they had technology for creating passages through rock without leaving obvious signatures that our geological surveys would detect. And if they maintained small populations, avoided direct contact with surface world deliberately, and only came near the surface occasionally for reasons we don't understand yet, they could have existed for significant periods without being detected by surface civilization. But why would they die now? Why would an entire subterranean civilization that had apparently been successful enough to survive for however long they existed suddenly collapse within a time frame compressed enough that we're finding recent remains? Disease is our primary working hypothesis, which is why CDC is leading the investigation. We're testing tissue samples from multiple sites for pathogens and finding several unusual bacteria and fungi that might have caused mass mortality across populations that weren't immune to them. But we're also seeing environmental indicators in the deep cave systems that suggest something changed recently in the conditions that these creatures or their civilization depended on. Dr. Walsh pulled up additional data showing chemical analysis of water and air samples collected from the deeper passages. The chemical composition of water in passages below 3 miles shows recent alteration, with pH levels and mineral content shifted in ways that would be toxic to most known life forms. We're seeing similar patterns across multiple sites globally, suggesting that whatever change occurred happened on a large scale rather than being localized to individual cave systems. If something disrupted the deep earth environment that these beings depended on, mass die-off would be the expected result, with populations dying over weeks or months as their environmental conditions deteriorated past survivable thresholds. David thought about the implications of what Dr. Walsh was describing, about an entire civilization dying because their environment changed in ways they couldn't adapt to or prevent. Is there any evidence of survivors? Any indication that some individuals or populations might have found ways to survive whatever changes killed the others? Not yet. Every site we've investigated shows the same pattern: recent death. No evidence of living individuals, populations that appear to have gone extinct completely within a compressed time frame. We're expanding our survey work to search more cave systems and deep tunnels, looking for any exceptions to that pattern, but so far we haven't found any. The briefing continued for another hour, Dr. Walsh sharing additional findings about the artificial structures that had been discovered, about the technology evident in the tunnel boring, about artifacts that suggested tool use and possibly agriculture or resource extraction conducted in the deep earth. The picture that emerged was of sophisticated civilization that had developed in parallel to surface humanity, completely unknown to us, adapting to extreme conditions and creating infrastructure that served their needs without ever intersecting with our activities in ways that would reveal their existence, until they started dying and their remains began appearing in caves shallow enough that humans would eventually find them, David thought. The discovery was accidental from the surface perspective, but it represented the revelation of something that had been hidden for however long the civilization had existed, brought to light only by their extinction and the preservation of their remains in cave conditions that prevented rapid decomposition. When the briefing ended and David emerged from Dr. Walsh's command tent, he found Bear waiting patiently outside, lying in a patch of sunlight, despite the cool forest temperature. She stood when she saw him, tail wagging in greeting, and David knelt to scratch behind her ears, needing the familiar comfort of her solid presence after the disorienting information he'd just absorbed. She leaned into his hand, pressing her head against his palm in the way she did when she sensed he was stressed or upset, offering the simple support that dogs provided better than any human counsel. "What do you think, girl? You knew something was wrong about that cave before I did. You detected something that made you want to investigate, made you dig at that rock slide until I paid attention. Do you understand what we found? Can you sense that there's something important about those remains? Something that goes beyond just big bones in a cave?" Bear huffed, her version of response when he asked questions she couldn't answer, and licked his face in her particular expression of affection and reassurance. She didn't understand the complexities of subterranean civilizations, or genetic engineering, or the investigation that had consumed the past several days, but she understood that David needed her steady presence, and she provided it with the same reliable devotion she'd shown throughout their partnership. David spent the rest of that day and the following ones in a strange limbo, confined to the camp but not imprisoned, required to stay available, but not actively involved in the investigation that continued around him. He watched teams come and go, observed equipment being deployed and samples being collected, listened to fragments of conversations between specialists trying to make sense of evidence that didn't fit any existing frameworks. And he thought constantly about what Dr. Walsh had told him, about the implications of discovering that Earth had hosted intelligent life beneath its surface that humans had never detected or imagined. The thought was humbling and unsettling in equal measure. Humans had developed technology that let us peer into distant galaxies, had sent probes to the edge of the solar system, had mapped the surface of Mars with greater detail than some regions of our own planet. But we'd been completely unaware of civilization existing beneath our feet, intelligent beings conducting their lives in the deep earth while we went about our surface existence in complete ignorance of their presence. What else didn't we know? What other forms of life or intelligence might exist in environments we hadn't thoroughly explored or in conditions we'd assumed were too extreme for complex biology? The ocean depths remained largely unmapped and unexplored, despite covering most of Earth's surface. The upper atmosphere and lower stratosphere hosted ecosystems we barely understood. And now, the deep Earth, the miles of rock beneath continents and oceans, had been revealed to contain complexities that our geological studies had missed entirely. The universe was turning out to be far stranger than anyone had anticipated, and David had stumbled into that strangeness by following his dog's instincts and pushing past a rockslide that most people would have ignored entirely. After a week at the camp, David was cleared to leave with the understanding that he'd remain available for additional questioning and that he'd continue to be monitored for any delayed health effects from his cave exposure. His sample results had come back negative for any known pathogens, and his physical condition remained normal despite the anxiety that came from processing what he'd discovered and what it meant. Bear was similarly cleared, showing no signs of illness or unusual behavior beyond her initial interest in the cave system. Dr. Walsh walked him to his truck when he was ready to depart, her manner professional, but with an undercurrent of genuine gratitude that made David feel his role in this discovery had been valued, rather than just being an inconvenient accident that had forced premature revelation of classified research. Mr. Park, you've made a significant contribution to our understanding of what exists beneath the surface, and your professionalism throughout this investigation has been exemplary. You followed proper protocols, reported through appropriate channels, cooperated fully with our team, and maintained discretion about information that could cause public panic if mishandled. That kind of responsible citizenship is rare and deeply appreciated. Thank you. I just did what seemed right given what I'd found, which is exactly my point. Many people who discover something this significant would try to exploit it personally, would post about it on social media before thinking about consequences, or would simply run away from something they didn't understand. You assessed the situation, made good decisions, and trusted the system to respond appropriately. That's commendable. She handed him a card with contact information. We'd like to continue working with you on this investigation. Your dog has shown abilities to detect these sites that our equipment can't match, and your experience as a cave surveyor makes you valuable for identifying locations where similar discoveries might be made. This would be paid work, probably more lucrative than your USGS contract, and it would involve travel to various sites where we need expertise in both cave navigation and animal behavior assessment. Are you interested? David looked at the card, then at Bear, who waited patiently beside his truck, then back at Dr. Walsh. The smart answer was probably no, was to extract himself from this situation before it consumed more of his life or put him at risks he couldn't fully assess. But he also recognized that normal life would feel hollow after what he'd discovered, that knowing what was being investigated and not participating would be harder than accepting the complications that came with continued involvement. And he couldn't ignore the fact that his USGS contract would end in a few months, and he'd need new income regardless. "I'm interested," he said, "but I need to establish clear boundaries about what I'm willing to do. I'll survey sites and provide expertise about cave systems and bears detection capabilities, but I won't enter any deep cave systems without proper backup and safety equipment, and I won't put bear at risk for the sake of investigation, regardless of how important the findings might be. Her welfare and mine are non-negotiable priorities." "Agreed. Those are exactly the boundaries we'd want you to maintain. We need skilled investigators who can work independently and make good decisions about risk management, not people who'll take unnecessary chances because they're excited about discoveries. Your caution is an asset, not a limitation." They shook hands, and David loaded Bear into his truck and drove away from the field station, watching in his rearview mirror as the tents and equipment grew smaller and then disappeared behind the forest that concealed so much more than anyone had previously imagined. He felt changed by the experience in ways he couldn't fully articulate, transformed by encountering evidence that the world contained mysteries deeper and more significant than his previous life had prepared him to understand. Over the next months, David and Bear traveled to multiple sites across the United States and eventually internationally, locations where similar remains had been discovered or where survey work suggested that discoveries were likely based on geological conditions that matched known sites. At each location, Bear's behavior provided valuable early indication of whether the site contained evidence of the subterranean species. Her instincts detecting signatures that expensive equipment couldn't register until teams had invested substantial time and resources in excavation. At a site in Tennessee, Bear alerted to a side passage that investigation teams hadn't prioritized for exploration, leading them to discover a cache of artifacts that appeared to be tools or possibly ritual objects designed for hands much larger than human. The artifacts were made from materials that analysis couldn't initially identify, showing properties that didn't match any known alloys or compounds in materials science databases. Subsequent analysis revealed they contained elements in configurations that shouldn't be stable under normal conditions, suggesting manufacturing processes that involved technologies beyond current human capabilities. At a site in Oregon, Bear's behavior led to the discovery of a chamber containing what looked like records or possibly art, walls covered in symbols that linguists studied for weeks, trying to determine whether they represented writing, mathematical notation, or purely decorative patterns. The symbols appeared to have structure and possibly grammar, suggesting they were used for communication rather than just aesthetic purposes, but their meaning remained opaque despite intensive analysis by experts in ancient languages and symbolic communication. At a site in New Mexico, Bear refused to enter a particular tunnel despite clear evidence from drone surveys that it led deeper into passages where more remains might be found. The team investigated anyway, sending drones equipped with more sophisticated sensors than previous models, and discovered that the tunnel led to a chamber containing what appeared to be remains of much smaller individuals, juveniles possibly, arranged in ways that suggested care and deliberate positioning rather than random death and decay. The discovery added another layer to understanding of the subterranean species, suggesting they had family structures and possibly funerary practices that implied cultural sophistication beyond simple biological existence. If you're invested in this investigation and finding yourself wondering what could have wiped out an entire hidden civilization without us noticing until their bodies started appearing in caves where people like David could stumble across them, you absolutely need to subscribe to follow this story to its conclusion, because what David and the research teams are about to discover goes far beyond just documenting extinct species and explains not just what these beings were, but why they died and whether the same threat that destroyed them could potentially affect surface life as well. Give this a like if you're finding the scientific approach to this mystery compelling and want to support content that takes discovery seriously, and share it with someone who'd appreciate how real investigation proceeds when confronted with evidence that challenges everything we thought we understood about our planet. 6 months into his work with the investigation program, David had visited 18 sites and helped identify patterns that no single team would have recognized working in isolation on their individual locations. The subterranean species had been widespread geographically, present on every continent except Antarctica, based on current evidence, suggesting either they'd been created or had evolved long enough ago to spread globally, or they'd possessed technologies that allowed rapid geographic distribution despite living underground, where travel between continents would seem virtually impossible. The species showed variations across different sites, suggesting either regional adaptation over time or possibly indicating that multiple related species had existed rather than a single species inhabiting the entire global network. Some sites showed individuals with different proportions, skull shapes that varied in subtle ways, limb structures that suggested different locomotive adaptations. But all shared the fundamental characteristics: massive size, cave adaptations, genetic evidence of engineering or modification, and recent death within a time frame that made their extinction a contemporary event rather than ancient history. The theories about what had caused the extinction multiplied as more evidence accumulated, and as teams with different specializations brought their perspectives to analyzing the available data. Disease remained the primary hypothesis, given CDC's role in the investigation, with focus on novel pathogens that had been recovered from tissue samples and that showed unusual properties suggesting they might have contributed to population collapse. But other theories gained support as environmental data revealed changes in deep Earth conditions that would have made survival difficult regardless of disease pressures. Volcanic activity in several regions had increased over the past decade, releasing gases and altering chemistry in deep cave systems. Mining operations in various countries had penetrated depths where they might have inadvertently disrupted ecosystems without realizing they were affecting occupied habitats. Climate change on the surface was causing shifts in hydrology that affected underground water systems, changing flow patterns and potentially introducing contaminants or depleting resources that subterranean life depended on. And seismic activity, while not showing obvious increases globally, had occurred in specific regions that corresponded to some of the sites where remains had been found, suggesting that earthquakes might have destroyed infrastructure or sealed passages that the subterranean civilization needed for survival. The breakthrough in understanding came at a site in West Virginia, discovered through survey work that David and Bear participated in alongside an expanded team that included geologists, biologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and military security personnel whose presence had become standard at all investigation sites once the government fully understood the scope of what was being documented. The West Virginia site contained the most extensive artificial structures yet discovered, a complex of chambers and passages that had clearly been carved or constructed rather than being natural cave formations. The walls showed tool marks, but also showed evidence of technologies that went beyond simple hand tools, surfaces that were too smooth and precise to have been created by mechanical excavation alone. And the walls were covered in the symbolic writing that had been seen at other sites, but here with much more extensive coverage and with what appeared to be narrative structure rather than just isolated symbols. A team of linguists and anthropologists spent weeks in the chamber documenting and analyzing the symbols, and slowly a partial translation emerged based on patterns and repetitions that suggested certain symbols represented common concepts or grammatical structures. The translation was preliminary and uncertain, requiring assumptions about how the subterranean species had thought and communicated, but it provided enough coherence that researchers felt confident they were extracting actual meaning rather than just imposing patterns onto meaningless decoration. The symbols told a story, fragmentary and difficult to interpret completely, but clearly describing the history and recent experiences of the civilization that had created them. The narrative described a people who had lived underground for periods that the translation couldn't make precise, but that seemed to span many generations by human reckoning. They'd thrived in the deep earth, developing technologies and social structures that supported large populations in environments that would be fatal to surface life. They'd mined minerals and possibly grown food through methods that weren't clear from the available symbols, creating sustainability that allowed their civilization to persist across time periods that made their tenure underground comparable to the entire span of human civilization on the surface. But the later portions of the narrative described change, recent and catastrophic, relative to their history. Something had entered their territory from depths even greater than those they normally inhabited, from regions below their deepest explorations. The symbols described this intrusion variously as darkness, as poison, as consumer, using metaphors that suggested the threat was difficult for them to understand or describe concretely even in their own language. Whatever this threat was, it had spread upward through the tunnel systems, destroying or consuming everything it encountered, forcing the subterranean civilization to retreat toward the surface in desperate attempt to escape what was pursuing them. The narrative showed attempts to fight or contain the threat, efforts that failed as the pursuing force proved too pervasive or too resilient to be stopped by whatever methods the civilization possessed. And finally, the narrative showed resignation and despair as the writers or carvers of these symbols understood they were the last of their kind, that their civilization was ending, that the threat had pursued them to heights where they couldn't survive long-term, but where they hoped to at least record their existence before extinction claimed them completely. Dr. Walsh reviewed the translation work extensively before briefing David and selected team members on what had been discovered. They met in a larger command tent that had been established at the West Virginia site, with screens showing images of the symbol-covered walls and documents containing the linguist's translation notes and interpretive commentary. "This changes our understanding significantly," Dr. Walsh began, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to share information that would reframe everything that had been previously discussed. "We've been treating this situation as extinction, caused by disease or environmental change, natural processes that unfortunately destroyed a species we didn't know existed. But the narrative these symbols tell suggests something more actively threatening, something that came from deeper in the earth and deliberately pursued or consumed this civilization as it tried to flee." She pulled up images showing specific symbol sequences that the linguists had identified as particularly significant. They describe what they were fleeing from using terms that our translators interpret as the ascending darkness, or possibly the black rise, metaphors that could be poetic descriptions of disease or environmental toxin, but that the context suggests might be more literal references to an actual substance or entity that was moving upward through the cave systems. "You're saying they were running from something?" David asked, feeling cold spread through his chest as he processed the implications. "Some kind of predator or threat that came from below them?" "That's what the narrative suggests, yes. And David, if that's accurate, if there's something in the deep earth that's capable of pursuing and destroying a civilization that had adapted to those conditions over extended time periods, we need to understand what it is and whether it poses any threat to the surface world." The subterranean civilization retreated upward, trying to escape it, but they couldn't reach the surface. They were physiologically adapted for deep Earth conditions and probably couldn't survive in our atmosphere or temperature ranges. But whatever was chasing them might not have the same limitations. She pulled up more data, showing chemical analysis and unusual readings from deep cave systems at multiple sites. We've been finding anomalous chemical signatures in the deepest passages we can access, compounds that shouldn't be present in natural cave environments and that show some properties of biological activity. We've also been detecting electromagnetic anomalies and temperature fluctuations in certain deep tunnels that don't match normal geothermal gradients. Initially, we assumed these were measurement errors or equipment malfunctions, but the pattern is consistent across multiple sites using different instrument types, suggesting they represent real phenomena that we need to investigate. She paused, seeming to gather resolve before continuing. We're planning an expedition to push deeper into the tunnel system here at the West Virginia site, to descend below the levels where the subterranean species was living, and to try to determine what they were fleeing from and whether it's still active in the deep earth. This will be the most ambitious exploration we've attempted, requiring specialized equipment and personnel who can handle extreme conditions. I'd like you and Bear to participate, both because her instincts have proven valuable for detecting dangers before our equipment registers them, and because your cave experience and military background make you qualified for this kind of operation. David felt the weight of the request settle over him. Everything in his cautious nature said this was exactly the kind of risky exploration he should decline, that pushing into unknown depths, pursuing threats that had destroyed an entire civilization, was poor survival planning. But he also understood that someone needed to go, that the threat needed to be assessed, and that his skills and Bear's instincts might make the difference between successful reconnaissance and disaster. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety building in his chest. "But I need full briefing on safety protocols, emergency extraction plans, and clear authority to abort if conditions exceed acceptable risk thresholds. And Bear comes back to the surface if she shows signs of distress or fear at any point in the descent, regardless of what that means for the mission timeline." "Agreed. This is reconnaissance, not a suicide mission. We need information, but not at the cost of losing team members." The Deep Earth expedition was scheduled for 2 weeks out, giving time for equipment to be assembled and for team members to train together on the technical climbing and navigation that would be required. David spent that time reviewing cave diving and vertical techniques, refreshing skills he'd learned during mountain warfare training but hadn't used extensively since leaving service. He also worked with Bear on commands and signals that might be needed in environments where verbal communication would be difficult or impossible, reinforcing her training and strengthening their partnership for what would probably be the most challenging operation they'd undertaken together. The team, assembled at the West Virginia site, included David and Bear, Dr. Walsh's mission leader, 2 experienced technical cavers who specialized in deep vertical systems, a geologist, a biologist whose expertise was extremophile organisms, and 3 military personnel whose specific roles weren't clearly defined, but whose presence suggested security concerns that went beyond standard cave exploration. Everyone underwent medical screening and was fitted with specialized equipment, including rebreather systems that would allow extended time at depth, thermal protection for expected temperature extremes, and communication systems that could function in conditions where normal radio would be blocked by rock. The descent began at dawn on a cold October morning, the team entering the cave system through passages that were now familiar from weeks of previous exploration. They moved through the chambers where remains had been found, past the walls covered in symbolic writing that told the story of civilization's collapse, and eventually reached the technology-board tunnel that descended at steep angle into depths no human had previously attempted to access. The tunnel was precisely 8 feet in diameter, its walls showing the impossible smoothness that suggested construction methods beyond current human engineering capabilities. The team descended using rope systems anchored at intervals that had been established during previous reconnaissance, their progress slow and methodical as they checked each anchor point and tested conditions before committing to each new section of descent. The temperature increased steadily as they descended, following the normal geothermal gradient that added roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 100 feet of depth. By the time they'd descended 3 miles, the temperature had reached over 90 degrees, despite the cooling systems in their suits, and the team took its first extended rest stop to hydrate and verify that equipment was functioning properly. Bear showed signs of stress from the heat and the confined spaces, panting heavily and looking to David for reassurance that this was safe activity rather than dangerous situation she should be warning him about. David provided water and cooling, speaking to her in quiet tones that reassured without being able to explain why they were doing this or what they hoped to find. She trusted him enough to continue, but her anxiety was clear, and David resolved to bring her back to the surface if conditions got worse or if she showed real fear rather than just stress. At 4 miles depth, they reached a point where the tunnel opened into a larger passage. Not quite a cavern, but a natural or artificially expanded conduit that showed signs of having carried water at some point, though it was dry now. The temperature had climbed to 115 degrees, approaching the limits of what their cooling systems could effectively manage for extended periods. The team paused here for longer rest and consultation about whether to continue deeper or to consider this depth sufficient for initial reconnaissance. Dr. Walsh made the decision to push forward to 5 miles, a depth that would represent the limit of their planned penetration for this expedition. They descended the final mile through passages that alternated between the technology board tunnel and what appeared to be natural cave development, suggesting the subterranean civilization had built their tunnels through regions where caves already existed, possibly using those natural features to guide their construction or to access specific locations in the deep earth. At 5 miles below the surface, they reached what appeared to be a transition point between the territory the subterranean species had inhabited and something else, something deeper that they'd apparently avoided or hadn't explored. The passage here showed less evidence of artificial modification, returning to natural cave development with formations that suggested this area had been growing undisturbed for geological timescales. And the temperature, surprisingly, began to decrease rather than continuing to rise, dropping from the 125 degrees they'd measured just a quarter mile higher to around 110 degrees, suggesting some kind of cooling mechanism or possibly airflow from depths where different thermal conditions prevailed. The team set up a base position here, establishing anchor points and equipment caches that would support extended observation and sample collection. Then, the 2 technical cavers, supported by Dr. Walsh and the military personnel, pushed deeper into the passage, moving slowly and methodically while the rest of the team monitored from the established position. David stayed with Bear at the base position, both of them watching the depths where the advance team had disappeared and listening to their reports over the communication system. The reports were sparse initially, just confirmations of position and conditions as they descended further. But then one of the cavers reported something that made everyone at base position go silent and alert. "We've reached a cavern, dimensions unknown but extremely large based on how our lights are absorbed. The floor is covered in substance we can't immediately identify, appears to be black fluid or possibly organic matter. Temperature has dropped further, now reading 98 degrees. We're collecting samples. The biologist at base position spoke into the comm system. Can you describe the substance in more detail? Is it moving? Does it have odor? Are there any visible organisms or structures? It appears to be organic, possibly bacterial mat, or possibly something more complex. It's definitely not water or any normal cave sediment. It has texture, almost like it's alive, but I'm not seeing obvious motion. There's an odor, hard to describe through the respirator, but it's organic and unfamiliar. Bear suddenly stood from where she'd been lying beside David, her body going rigid and her hackles rising along her spine. She stared at the passage where the advance team had descended, and a low growl built in her throat, the warning sound she made when she detected threats her training had prepared her to recognize. David had heard that growl during their military service only when genuine danger was present, and hearing it now in the depths beneath West Virginia made his blood run cold. Dr. Walsh. Bear is showing threat response. Something down there is triggering her defensive instincts. The advance team went silent for several seconds, then one of them spoke again, voice tighter with controlled alarm. The substance is moving, slowly but definitely moving. It's flowing toward us, or possibly just responding to our presence. We're retreating to base position. But they didn't make it back before the situation escalated. The biologist at base position, who'd been monitoring instrument readings, suddenly called out readings that made no sense in context. Pressure wave approaching from below. Massive displacement. Something big is moving fast through the passage. The advance team appeared in the distance, their lights visible first as they climbed rapidly toward base position, moving with the controlled urgency of people fleeing serious threat, but maintaining enough discipline not to panic and make mistakes. They reached base position and reported breathlessly while beginning immediate ascent toward the surface. The substance isn't just biological mat. It's alive. It's mobile, and it responded to our presence by flowing toward us rapidly. We could see it climbing the walls, moving against gravity, pursuing us. We need to evacuate immediately and seal this tunnel before it reaches the surface. The team ascended as quickly as safety allowed, no longer pausing for careful anchor checks, but trusting the systems they'd established and accepting calculated risks in favor of speed. David climbed with Bear secured in a support harness, both of them moving upward through the tunnel, while below them, the team's instruments registered the black substance continuing its upward movement, following them, but at a slower pace that suggested they could outrun it if they maintained their current ascent rate. They reached the 3-mile depth marker and paused briefly to verify everyone was accounted for and equipment was functioning. The substance was still following, now 2 miles below them, and rising steadily. Dr. Walsh made the call to continue evacuation and to implement the tunnel sealing protocol that had been established as contingency plan before the expedition began. Military personnel, who'd remained at upper levels, deployed charges at strategic points in the tunnel. Explosive devices designed to collapse sections and block passage without bringing down the entire cave system. The detonation sequence was timed to allow the ascending team to pass through each section before it was sealed, creating a series of blockages that should prevent the substance from continuing to pursue toward the surface. The team reached the surface after 6 hours of hard climbing, exhausted and carrying samples that would need immediate analysis in the most secure biological facilities available. The tunnel below them was sealed at 5 points, each collapse confirmed through seismic monitoring and visual inspection from above. Whether the seals would hold permanently or whether the substance would find ways around them remained uncertain, but the immediate threat of it reaching the surface had been contained. David emerged into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the days spent in darkness, and he sat heavily while medical personnel checked him and Bear for any signs of exposure or injury. His body ached from the climb. His mind was spinning with what they'd encountered, and his anxiety was manifesting as tremors in his hands that he couldn't quite control. But he was alive, Bear was safe, and they'd gathered information that would be critical for understanding what had destroyed the subterranean civilization and whether surface world faced similar threats. The debriefing lasted hours, Dr. Walsh questioning everyone about what they'd seen and experienced, correlating observations across team members, building comprehensive picture of what existed at depth and how it had responded to human presence. The sample collected by the advance team before their retreat was immediately transported to CDC's highest biosafety facility for analysis under containment protocols that prevented any risk of the substance escaping into external environment. Analysis results started coming back within days, and what they revealed made the decision to seal the tunnel seem urgently necessary rather than just precautionary. The black substance was biological, showing cellular structure that didn't match any known taxonomic category. It wasn't bacterial, wasn't fungal, wasn't anything that fit into existing classification systems for life on Earth. But it was definitely alive, and the samples showed evidence of feeding, of consuming organic matter through mechanisms that suggested it would digest anything biological it encountered. More concerning was evidence that the substance could survive, and possibly thrive, in conditions ranging from the deep Earth environments where it had been discovered up through conditions that would be present at or near the surface. Temperature tolerance tests showed it remained active across ranges that would allow it to function in most surface environments. Chemical analysis showed it could metabolize a wide variety of organic compounds, suggesting it wouldn't be limited by specific food sources. And mobility tests confirmed it could move against gravity and through obstacles using mechanisms that weren't fully understood, but that made it effectively capable of spreading through any connected passages or even through porous rock if given enough time. The substance wasn't just the remnant of whatever had killed the subterranean civilization. It might still be actively expanding, seeking new territory and new resources to consume, operating according to biological imperatives that made it a persistent threat to anything living in its path. Dr. Walsh briefed David on these findings in her office at CDC headquarters in Atlanta, where he'd been brought for more extensive debriefing and medical monitoring following the expedition. She looked more concerned than David had seen her during the entire investigation, her professional composure strained by the implications of what her analysis teams had discovered. "Mr. Park, we're calling this substance the Deep Rise organism for official documentation purposes. It represents a novel life form that appears to have originated in the deep Earth, probably at depths far below where the subterranean civilization was living. At some point, probably recently on geological timescales, it began expanding upward, entering territory where other life forms existed and consuming or displacing them as it spread." "And you think this is what killed the entire subterranean civilization?" "That's our assessment, yes. They documented it in their symbolic writing, described it as darkness or consumer ascending from below, and the physical evidence supports that interpretation. The organism doesn't just kill individual creatures, it consumes entire ecosystems, breaking down organic matter and incorporating it into its own biomass. The subterranean civilization tried to flee upward, but couldn't survive at shallow enough depths to escape it permanently. We're finding evidence at multiple sites that they tried to seal tunnels and create barriers, but the organism eventually found ways through every barrier they created. And now it's in tunnels beneath multiple locations globally, sealed, but potentially looking for ways to continue spreading." "Yes. We've implemented sealing protocols at every site where we've detected its presence, using explosives and chemical barriers, and in some cases permanent concrete installations designed to prevent passage. But we're also establishing monitoring networks to detect if it finds alternative routes or if our seals fail. This is a threat that will require ongoing vigilance and possibly active containment for the foreseeable future." David looked out the window of Dr. Walsh's office, watching Atlanta's downtown traffic flow past, in patterns that suggested normalcy and routine. Life continuing for millions of people who had no idea what existed miles beneath their feet or what efforts were being made to keep that existence from affecting their surface world. Does anyone else know about this? Has the information been shared with other governments or with the public? Selected officials in multiple countries have been briefed on classified basis, yes. International cooperation has been established for monitoring and containment at sites in various nations, but public disclosure has been determined to be counterproductive given current circumstances. Causing panic about a threat that's currently contained and being managed would generate more problems than it would solve. The assessment is that people don't need to know about this unless and until circumstances change in ways that require public awareness and action. So we just maintain containment indefinitely, keep monitoring and sealing and hoping the organism doesn't find ways to breach our barriers? That's the current plan, yes. It's not perfect, but it's manageable given the resources we're committing to the effort. And Mr. Park, your role in this ongoing operation is critical. Your ability to work with Bear to detect presence of the organism before our instruments register it. Your experience navigating cave systems, your judgment about risk assessment and threat evaluation. All of those skills make you valuable for the monitoring program we're establishing. We'd like to offer you a permanent position coordinating field operations for the Deep Rise Containment Initiative. David had been expecting some version of this offer, had known that his involvement in the discovery and his capabilities would make him attractive for continued work with whatever program emerged from the investigation. He thought about what acceptance would mean, years of his life devoted to monitoring threat most people would never know existed, constant travel to sites where sealed tunnels required verification and where new breaches might demand immediate response, living with knowledge of danger that couldn't be shared with anyone outside the classified program. But he also thought about what would happen if he declined. If he tried to return to normal life, knowing what existed beneath the surface, and knowing that his skills could contribute to protecting surface civilization from that existence. He'd served in the army because he believed in defending against threats to his country and to human welfare more broadly. This was just a different kind of threat, one that required different skills, but the same fundamental commitment to standing between danger and the people who needed protection from it. "I'll accept the position," he said, "under the same conditions I established before. Bear and I work as a team. We maintain authority to assess risk and withdraw if conditions exceed acceptable thresholds, and we're provided with support and resources needed to do this work effectively." "Agreed. Welcome to the Deep Rise Containment Initiative, Mr. Park. I think you're going to be critical to our success in managing this threat for as long as management proves possible." They shook hands, and David understood that his life had just taken another sharp turn from the path he'd imagined when he'd started his USGS cave mapping contract months ago. He'd gone from simple survey work to discovering extinct civilization, to now serving as field coordinator for an ongoing program monitoring threats from the deep earth that could potentially devastate surface life if containment failed. It was a strange career trajectory by any measure, but it felt right in ways David couldn't fully articulate. He'd found purpose that connected to his military values, had work that used his skills effectively, and had partnership with Bear that gave both of them meaning beyond simple survival. If that work required keeping secrets and living with knowledge that most people didn't share, well, he'd done that during his service too. This was just continuation of the same fundamental commitment to standing guard against threats that most people never saw and that someone needed to monitor constantly to prevent from becoming disasters. The Deep Rise Containment Initiative operated through the next years with David as one of its key field operatives, traveling to sites around the world where the organism's presence had been detected and where sealing operations needed to be implemented or verified. Bear remained his partner throughout, her instincts continuing to provide early warning about locations where the organism was approaching breakthrough, despite supposedly secure seals. Together they became known within the classified program as the team with the highest detection success rate, finding breaches or potential breaches before they became critical and requiring emergency response. The work was demanding physically and psychologically, requiring constant vigilance and regular exposure to environments and conditions that took their toll, despite best efforts at safety protocols and support systems. David aged through those years, his hair going grey earlier than genetics alone would predict, and his body accumulating wear from countless descents into deep cave systems and from the stress of maintaining alertness during long monitoring sessions. Bear aged beside him, her muzzle whitening and her pace slowing, though her nose remained sharp and her detection capabilities never diminished, even as her physical endurance did. When Bear was 12 years old and beginning to struggle with the physical demands of field work, David made the decision to retire her from active duty while keeping her with him in advisory capacity. She'd earned her rest, had served longer than most working dogs, and had contributed more to human safety than anyone outside the program would ever know. The Deep Rise Containment Initiative honored her service with a ceremony that couldn't be public, but that recognized her role in protecting surface civilization from threats that had destroyed an entire subterranean species. David continued working with new dogs trained to Bear's protocols, passing on the methods she'd demonstrated for detecting the organism and teaching younger handlers how to read their animals' behavioral signals effectively. But none of the new dogs ever quite matched Bear's capabilities, and David privately believed that her unique combination of natural instinct and military training had created detection abilities that couldn't be fully replicated through standard training programs. Bear passed peacefully in her sleep when she was 14, her body simply stopping after a long life of service that had taken her from military operations in Afghanistan to discoveries in Kentucky caves to monitoring operations at sites across the globe. David buried her at a location in the Daniel Boone National Forest, not far from where they'd made their initial discovery, marking the grave with a stone that read, "Bear, Partner, Guardian." She sensed what threatened us before we could understand the danger, and her vigilance protected countless lives that will never know her name. The Deep Rise Containment Initiative continued its work, growing from small team responding to initial discovery into an international program with hundreds of personnel and substantial resources allocated from multiple governments. The organism remained contained through careful monitoring and aggressive sealing of any passages where breakthrough seemed possible, though several close calls required emergency response, and taught the program that eternal vigilance wasn't just philosophical principle, but operational necessity. David eventually moved from field operations to training and coordination roles as his age and accumulated injuries made the physical demands of cave descent increasingly difficult. He mentored younger operatives, taught courses on threat assessment and containment protocols, and helped develop technologies that improved detection and sealing methods. His experience from the initial discovery through years of field operations made him invaluable for institutional memory and for maintaining focus on lessons that needed to be passed to each new generation of program personnel. 20 years after finding the first skeleton in Kentucky, David was 58 years old and recognized as a founding member of the Deep Rise Containment Initiative, whose early decisions and operational approaches had shaped how the program functioned. He'd been promoted multiple times, had received classified awards and commendations that he couldn't display publicly, and had established a legacy that extended far beyond anything he'd imagined when following Bear's instincts to investigate a rockslide that most people would have ignored completely. The organism remained a persistent threat, appearing at new locations occasionally as it apparently found alternative routes upward through geological structures that weren't obvious to surface mapping. Each appearance was met with established protocols that David had helped develop, and the success rate for containment remained high enough that the threat was considered managed rather than imminent. But the knowledge that something alive and hostile existed in the deep earth, seeking access to surface world with patient persistence that might eventually find weak points in containment, shaped how everyone in the program approached their work and their understanding of Earth's complexity. David retired from active program involvement at 65, his body finally insisting on rest that his mind was reluctant to accept. He settled in Kentucky, not far from the original discovery site, the location that had started his transformation from cave surveyor to guardian against deep earth threats. He wrote extensively, producing classified reports and training materials that would guide future generations of containment operatives. And he remained available as consultant, his experience and institutional knowledge making him valuable resource even when he could no longer participate in field operations. When David passed at age 73, his death was noted in classified channels with recognition of his contributions to protecting surface civilization from threats that most people would never know existed. The Deep Rise Containment Initiative held memorial ceremony at the Kentucky site, planting a tree beside Bear's grave and marking David's ashes with a companion stone that acknowledged his role in discovering the threat and dedicating decades to ensuring it remained contained. His legacy continued through the protocols he'd helped establish, through the operatives he'd trained, through the understanding he'd contributed to humanity's knowledge of what existed in the deep earth and how surface life could be protected from it. The program he'd helped create continued its work, watching for organism appearances, containing breaches when they occurred, maintaining barriers between surface world and the depths that harbored forms of life incompatible with human civilization. And in cave systems around the planet, at depths where humans could barely survive, even with technological support, the Deep Rise organism continued its slow, patient movement upward, testing barriers and seeking routes that containment hadn't sealed, representing a threat that might persist for centuries or millennia, requiring vigilance from generation after generation of humans who accepted responsibility for standing between their species and dangers from the deep earth that would consume. Everything organic if given opportunity to spread unchecked. The world continued in its patterns, with surface populations going about their lives mostly unaware of what existed below or what efforts maintained separation between their world and the depths. That ignorance was blessing in many ways, allowing normal life to continue without the weight of understanding that beneath every step existed complexity and danger that could fundamentally change everything if containment ever failed comprehensively. But those who knew, who worked in the program and carried knowledge that David and Bear had helped discover, remained vigilant in memory of those who'd served before and in recognition that their work protected not just current populations, but all future generations who would inhabit surface world. The threat was managed but not eliminated, contained but not destroyed, and that reality demanded continued effort that could never truly end as long as the organism persisted in the depths seeking upward expansion. And on quiet nights in Kentucky, when wind moved through forest that had witnessed so much discovery and transformation, you could almost hear the echoes of decisions made years earlier, of a dog insisting on investigating a rock slide and a veteran trusting those instincts enough to follow them into caverns that revealed truths about Earth's hidden complexity. Those echoes carried forward through time, shaping how containment program operated and reminding everyone involved that sometimes the most important discoveries came from paying attention to what seemed improbable, from trusting instincts that couldn't be rationally explained, from understanding that courage and wisdom both mattered when confronting mysteries that demanded acknowledgement, even when their implications challenged everything we thought we understood about our world.